Okay, great. Well, turn it over to Andrew. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you very much for having me. Bonjour tout le monde. Good to see everybody on a Thursday night. My name is Dr. Andrew Davidson. I am the Acting Associate Director for the Agroclimate, Geomatics and Earth Observation Division at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. I'm also the Earth Observation Operations Manager at Agri-Food Canada. And I am an adjunct research professor at Carleton University. This is a presentation that I've given a few times before. I modify it before every time I actually give the presentation. But before we start, I just sort of want to talk a little bit about what sort of motivates me to talk about this subject. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how to apply for jobs with the Government of Canada. And people say, well, it's not that difficult. You see an application and you apply for it. And the reality is it's not that simple. And there's a reason that the presentation title here is From the Outside Looking In. Just like any organization, whether it be the Government of Canada, the provincial government, or other organizations, you're at a distinct disadvantage for applying for positions if you actually don't know how to apply. Because each organization, the provinces, the government, and the federal government, each of these organizations have different ways and different mechanisms through which you apply. And unsurprisingly to many people, the federal government, the process in trying to be quite transparent, and the process in trying to make jobs that everybody can apply for, the process becomes quite cumbersome. The process becomes a little bit complex. But you need to understand how the process works in terms of sort of successfully navigating this process. And this is what we're going to talk about today. So for a bit of a background, I came to Ottawa in the early 2000s. I'd done a PhD at the University of Toronto, and I came to Ottawa to the Canada Centre of Remote Sensing to do a postdoc. And at that time, I was trying to get a research position or a permanent position with the Government of Canada. And I was applying for positions, as we all do, and this is 20 years ago. And back then, there was no online system. There was no jobs.gc.ca system on which we can apply as there is today. So what happened was you would go online, you'd see the jobs, and then they would be posted. And then you'd actually have to literally write a cover letter, send in your resume, print it out, and send it in. And over a period of about 2 or 3 years, I did a lot of applications for government jobs, some that I really wasn't qualified for, some I certainly was qualified for, and many that I was overqualified for. And not one time did I get a call inviting me to write a test. And I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand the process. I thought, I'm a fairly smart guy. I have a PhD, but I just can't get myself to go write a test or get an interview. What's the problem here? And then in and around 2002, I was complaining about this to a friend of mine who worked for public safety. And there was a good job that I really wanted with Agriculture Canada. And she said, come over to my house, we'll drink some wine and we'll go through your job application and we'll see what happens. So we came over and together we did the job application. And it was like a light bulb turned on because I realized there's a process, there's a way to do it. There's things that people are looking for. Things you'd never imagine that they were looking for. So I sent in my job application at that time, got an interview. I got a 3-year term position out of it as a climate data specialist. And that translated through the years over the last 10 years into the position I have now of acting director, all tracking back to that one first successful job application. And the thing was, during that period of time, when I was a term employee for the Government of Canada, that is, you're a full-time employee, you have all the benefits of the Government of Canada, but there's an end date to your position. I was looking for a permanent position. So I started applying, and I applied for pretty much anything that I was qualified for. I applied in something like 16 different departments, 10 different classifications. And out of all these applications, 9 times out of 10, I'd be invited for an interview. And I realized the more you do this, the more you practice, the more experience you get in applying for these jobs and applying at least what you're going to hear tonight, the more successful you will be. And people will come to you and they'll say, well, you're lucky. And it's like, well, no, it has nothing to do with luck. It has to do with practice. And just like anything else, you can get good at applying for jobs. And hopefully tonight, what you're going to hear a little bit about is some of the tips in terms of how to do that for the Government of Canada. So I have about 20 years of experience in negotiating this minefield that this Government of Canada hiring process. So if you don't know how it works, you are at a distinct disadvantage when it comes to applying for positions. You know, once you're in and once you see these processes from both sides of the table, you know, applying for jobs, but also interviewing people. You know, I've done a lot of competitions as a hiring manager, sitting on the manager and the HR side of the table. Once you're in and you understand how that process works, then it becomes infinitely easier. So there's two ways, like I've said, of actually obtaining this experience. One is sort of a hit or miss approach, which is what I was trying, and then eventually learning how this works. That takes time, it's frustrating, it's not a great place to be. Or you just go and you chat to somebody who knows the process, and fairly quickly you can start to apply those skills in the job process. And that was my motivation when I started giving these talks. As an instructor at Carleton University, whenever I would be teaching a course, one course a semester, towards the end of the semester during the lab hours, I would give this presentation. I'd say, we'll do an hour on how to get a job with the Government of Canada. And people thought it was good. And John picked up on some of that. And since then, every couple of years, I've done this for GoGeomatics too. Before we start, though, a couple of disclaimers. The first is that all views expressed are my own, and these views do not reflect those of the Government of Canada. The reason I say that is this is, I'm not in labor relations, and I'm not in human resources. So in many cases, when I'm talking today, this is from self-observation, my own observations of how this hiring process works. And I've been in rooms before where I've said something and human resources will say, well, actually, Andrew, it doesn't work that way. And I'll say, well, you think it doesn't work that way, but generally speaking, what we see, this is how it works. So I am not speaking on behalf of human resources of the Government of Canada. I actually, for all intents and purposes, will say that I have a Carleton hat on tonight. So I'm just sort of talking about this more objectively from an outsider's perspective. The second thing to note is that the hiring process for different classifications, they can vary a little bit. So for example, most of the job applications that you might do in the classifications that we would be interested in for geomatics, whether it be EG, which is sort of very much a technical classification, PC, which is a physical scientist classification, EC, which actually is economist, but it's really a social scientist classification, and variants thereof, they all follow the same kind of process. However, certain classifications such as EX, which is the executive sort of cadre of the Government of Canada, different process, and what we call RES, research science positions. And research science positions, you need a PhD, right? So research scientists with the Government of Canada, think of it as the government equivalent of being a professor at a university. Those hiring processes are somewhat different too, and they mimic in many ways actually the hiring processes at universities. We won't go into those tonight, though in both of these cases, there are some similarities. So I'm not going to cover those in detail, but what I will do is I will pick from sort of the generalized hiring process for the classifications that probably 99% of us in this room tonight would actually be interested in. So first of all, the typical federal government job competition involves a step of processes. What are these processes? And you see here on the screen these different processes. Now I say typically because in some cases, depending on the competition, there may not be a test. You might go straight to the interview stage, but I've only ever seen that for, I would say, more senior types of positions. But generally speaking, it follows the following steps. You have your job search. Fairly clearly, you go looking for the jobs that you want. We'll talk about that. And actually, we're going to talk about all of these steps on different slides. The application, so you submit your application. There's a couple of components to that. And when you submit your application, this is the foot in the door, right? If you don't submit your application correctly, you're gone, right? There is no room for error when you submit that application. If you're successful in the application, you will be invited to write a test or a series of tests. Usually one test, but it can be administered in different ways, and we'll talk about that. If you're successful in the test, you will be invited for an interview. And again, The interview is certain things associated, the way it's administered as well, which is useful, to discuss. And if you're successful in the interview, you've almost reached the end of the process. And what happens is they will then go on, the hiring committee will then go on and do a reference check. So 1 or 2 reference checks. And then there'll be a language assessment if applicable, right? So if, for example, you're applying for a bilingual position, it's at this point they would assess your language. So for example, you have a little bit of time through the process to make sure you can demonstrate your bilingualism if necessary. Once that's all done, the hiring manager will then create what we call a qualified pool of candidates. So however many candidates have made it all the way through and have qualified or considered qualified for the position, they make it into this pool from which the person being hired or the people being hired will be picked. And it's based on what we call best fit criteria. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these processes. How long does this take? Good question. Thank you for asking. How long does this take? It depends on the competition. So as you sort of go up in government, as you sort of come into sort of more senior levels, the application pool starts to narrow. And the application pool starts to narrow for a couple of reasons. One is that you're sort of doing more specialist stuff and things that are less people are qualified to do. And secondly, because sometimes we move from what we would call open external positions where everybody can apply for them to what we would call internal positions that can only be applied for by employees of the Government of Canada. But if you're in a job competition, for example, and 10 people have applied, then that whole process that you see on the screen right now may be done very, very quickly. However, let's say, for example, it's a much broader competition, something called pooled staffing, for example, that we'll talk about on a slide. You might get more than 1,000 applications. Think about that, 1,000 applications for a number of jobs. Somebody, or more accurately, a number of people, have to go through every single one of those 1,000 applications, and people have to be screened in and tested and interviewed and all these kinds of things. That can take a year. That can take more than a year. By the position I'm in right now, for example, took 12 months to staff. But I've seen positions elsewhere take much longer if you have a lot of applicants, right? So this whole process can take quite a while. So where do you start? Well, all of you should be familiar with the jobs.gc.ca. It's the website, Government of Canada website. The good news is it's set up in such a way right now that applying for a federal job has never been easier. We used to do all this stuff on paper, and then it was kind of half paper, half electronic. Right now, the way that jobs.gc.ca is set up is you can search for jobs, you can create a job profile, you can put your resume online, you apply for jobs, and they'll update you on the status of that competition online, which is absolutely fantastic. Because like I've said, with some of these long job competitions, one of the biggest frustrations people had was they'd maybe write a test and then they'd hear nothing for 4 months. I didn't hear anything for 4 months. Well, yes, that's because there was 600 people writing the test and we had to grade them all, right? So the jobs.gc.ca is where you want to be. All Government of Canada jobs, external positions and internal positions are posted through this site. And if you're not a Government of Canada employee, you don't get to see the internal positions, but you do get to see the external positions. So you have to apply electronically. There's no other way of applying. What you do is you go to jobs.gc.ca. You can actually set up the system in order to search for jobs. You would first of all create an account. Once you have an account, you create and maintain a profile that contains all your information that you update periodically. Your personal details, address, education, these kinds of things. But what you will also do is attach what we call a resume. And I'll talk about this in a second. A resume is a really important component of your job application process. Quite often in the language of the Government of Canada, in these job applications, people will say, what we want from you is a cover letter and a resume. Now, when we talk about these, what you're going to see is the cover letter really is text that describes where you explain and prove that you're qualified for the job. It's not really a cover letter because we're doing it electronically right now. But that language goes back to the days 20 years ago where you would actually write a cover letter. We'd write a cover letter and you'd send it in. But the resumes, so that's the first piece. But the second piece, the resume is the second piece, which is critically important because it's used as a secondary resource in terms of sort of being a tiebreaker, where you can actually go to a resume and see in detail what it is people have done. And we'll talk about that in a bit. You can also view your applications for jobs. You can view your applications for jobs that you've applied for or in the process of applying for. So you don't have to go in and apply all in one go. It used to be that you had to log in and submit all your application, and you couldn't save a half-finished job application. Now you can go in and you can work on it over a period of time and you can submit it. And then of course you see the application status of the jobs you've applied for. So this is your first stop. In there, and the first sort of piece of advice I give to people is when you put together your resumes, when you apply for a job, all this stuff is everybody's application is put into a digital PDF, which you can, obviously the hiring managers consult digitally, sometimes we print. But when it's converted into a PDF format, what we have to remember is that there's certain limitations of the system. So the resumes that you actually attach with your cover letter that we're going to describe are printed along with the applications for review by the hiring managers. And the first thing I'll say is this is less is more in terms of formatting and being fancy when it comes to the resumes. Because when you actually put your resume into the system, you copy it into a text box. There's no room for fancy formatting. There's no room for fancy indenting. And if you try and do all that fancy stuff when creating your resume online, when it ends up sort of being translated into the system and then printed to a PDF or printed out, you get a lot of badly formatted garbage. So what I say is when you create your resume in that system, format it using plain text, just like this example on this slide. So this is an example from my resume. I've changed some of the details, but it's just plain text. What that means is when this gets printed out or printed to PDF, that formatting is guaranteed to be retained. When you try and do real fancy stuff with your resumes, it comes out looking bad. And then the hiring manager quite often can't make any sense of it. The second thing to note is that the resumes are used as supporting material to cover letter applications. So from that perspective, with the cover letters, we will actually look at those cover letters because you're demonstrating in the cover letters that you meet the job descriptions, but the resume provides the additional detail for us to sort of peel back the layers and better understand, what's going on. So if you actually go to the Government of Canada website, what we see here is this is the home site for the Government of Canada, Government Canada jobs. You see here, there is a link to search for government jobs. And this is where you can go in and you can set up your profile. You can select whether you want to actually get announcements. You can select whether you want to get, for example, email or updates, for example. You can specify different classifications, keywords, all the things that you're interested in. Do you want to get email or notification once a week? Do you want to get them daily, et cetera, et cetera? I always used to set them up for daily. Now, daily can fill your email box up because you get one daily email. But in some cases, you have to be careful because when jobs come up on the Government of Canada website, they may only be up for a week or 5 days. For some of them, the application period is very short and you have to be very careful because you can miss it. So you go to the website here, search for government jobs, and this will allow you to actually start to choose the kinds of jobs that you're interested in and query them. Now, if you actually do your job search, what you actually see on this page is the different types of tabs. Jobs open to the public is what you would be interested in. Internal jobs, you have to be internal to the Government of Canada. So if you're not a Government of Canada employee, you're not eligible to apply for those. And then the other tabs here, you just ignore. Those 3 tabs here are basic, what we call notices of appointment. And the acronyms mean various things. So the three tabs on the right-hand side here, if you would click on those and look, these are basically the notices of people who are going to get who are going to be appointed to positions and competitions that have finished up. And that's kind of the way the process works. You go through the entire process, and if somebody actually wants to give you a job, it then gets posted on this website saying our intent is to offer John Smith or Amy Smith a job with Agriculture Canada at the PC2 level, and then that gets posted for a week, notification, and then the letter of offer is sent out. And that's because for various reasons, one of which is that sort of you get a window of time in that job competition for people to sort of, I would say, I won't say grieve, but people to, and grieve actually has a technical meaning in this sense, but for people to ask questions in terms of, I won't say the validity of the hire, but question the hire for one reason or another if they had valid reasons to do, if they had valid reasons to do so. So ignore all those tabs, but you see the jobs open to the public here. You know, a whole bunch of jobs will come up. For this example, I forget even what I queried, but if we go down to say some of the jobs that we might be interested in, and if we take a look here, once we start to open up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some examples here, but when you open up the job posting, you're going to see various things. There's going to be details on the job itself, so the title of the position, the department, the location or possible locations, the classification, physical scientist, biologist, chemist, e.g., these kinds of things, plus the level, PC1 through PC5, for example, the associated salary range, the closing date of the process, it's usually midnight Western Pacific time, the process ID, a reference and number, which you could use to actually reference the specific competition if you're talking to human resources, for example, the employment tenure and the number of vacancies. So the vacancies might be one, it might be a number of them, but the last 2 points here are important. So first of all, employment tenure, what does that mean? That means it might be an indeterminate position. That means it's a permanent position. You're hired and you're in and you've got a permanent government job. Or it might be something called a term or a determinate position. And these are usually where we get pulses of money coming in for 2 years or 3 years, where we get to hire a government employee, but it's a sort of a sunset kind of term where at the end of 3 years, that money disappears. So we're able to hire people at various levels to come in and work with us for 2 years or 3 years, but the position ends after 3 years. Okay, and that is a sort of a determinate or a term position. And in terms of vacancies, you know, they'll say 1 or 2. Sometimes they won't give you a number. They'll just say anticipatory hiring. And what that means is what people have said, what anticipatory hiring means is we don't know how many people we want to hire. We don't want to commit to a given number. We think we're going to get a pulse of money coming in. We want to be ready for when that opportunity arises. And then we're going to hire somebody or hire a number of people. The other things in the posting will be who can apply and citizenship requirements. Generally speaking, you have to be a Canadian citizen. I say generally speaking, more often than not, if you're not a Canadian citizen, you have to jump through a lot of hoops to do justifications for even to hire a permanent resident. I've only ever in 20 years seen a non-Canadian, non-resident hired into a very, very specialized position. So generally speaking, it becomes a lot tougher. If you're not a Canadian citizen, it becomes very, very difficult, certainly in Agriculture Canada at least, to obtain a position. So some of these requirements. The requirements of the position, which is what we generally refer to as the statement of merit criteria. And it's important to pay attention to these because we have what's known as essential qualifications, asset qualifications, and then the 3 other bullet points refer to operational requirements, organizational needs, and the conditions of employment. And it's the first 2 in our application that we really, really need to pay attention to. So essential qualifications are exactly that. Here are the things you need to have at the time of applying to get the job, mostly. Now, the only exception to an essential class qualification is if you need to have a certain level of bilingualism. That's not tested at the time of application. That's tested at the time that they might offer you the job. However, but you still need to have it. right? So it is an essential qualification to get the job. But when you're applying for the job, these essential qualifications will be education, like I've said, language proficiency, but that comes at the end of the process, your experience, knowledge, abilities and skills, and what we call personal suitability. These are essential qualifications. And if you miss out on any of these, you get what we call screened out of the process. So if they're asking for a master's degree and you don't have a master's degree, but you have 20 years of experience, too bad. You don't have that essential qualification. If you don't have the knowledge as demonstrated through a test, too bad, right? Now, asset qualifications are different. These I sort of thought the categorize under the sort of the nice to haves. So with the asset qualifications, these are ones, they're kind of tie-breaking questions. We don't require you to have these, but it would be nice. So we need you to have an undergraduate degree, but we kind of like you to have a master's. We want you to have experience in remote sensing, asset qualification, especially, for example, processing synthetic aperture radar. And the asset qualifications, if you miss any of those, you don't have to worry about it because you don't actually get screened out. So they won't throw your application in the trash, figuratively. They won't get rid of your application or not invite you to come and do a test if you miss the asset qualifications. But having, obviously, and demonstrating you meet a lot of these asset qualifications are important. And then the final bullet points here, operational requirements, is things like, driver's license, working overtime, these kind of generic things that most people say they can do. And then organizational needs and sort of more sort of legalese in here. The operational requirements may be important if it requires you to do shift work and you can't do shift work. Maybe it does require a driver's license of a given class and you don't have that, right? So those are operational requirements. You have to meet the operational requirements of that job. And then additionally, there will be additional instructions on applying for the position. And some departments provide, how would I say, different levels of instructions in terms of applying for the position. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. I forgot this, I put these animations in here. So let's take a look at an example from fairly recently. This is a remote sensing and geomatics expert. 8th of January, 2021. This is working with Rennie Chenier, a colleague of mine for Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So this is what you would see if you actually went to the website, and all that information is there. Top right hand side, there's a reference number, there's a selection process number. If you're talking to DFO about the status of applications or you have questions, these are the things you would reference specific to that competition. You see here it's a PC2 position, physical scientist level 2, salary range 73,000 up to about 88. Other information on the organization, there's a link. Here's a closing date. Like I said, it's usually midnight Pacific time. Who can apply? Persons residing in Canada and Canadian citizens riding abroad, usually Canadians, so Canadian citizens. Like I say, sometimes it depends on permanent residents. I can only speak from my perspective at Agriculture Canada, where it's been very difficult to justify hiring a permanent residents. It's usually been Canadian citizens or mostly Canadian citizens who've qualified, but other departments might be different. And then the link here is apply online. And then underneath what you see is here are the duties. This basically describes the job, what you would be doing if you actually won this competition. So there's some important messages. Now, these important messages here aren't actually from this competition. The top one here, these important messages, I actually took from an Agriculture and Agri Canada position, because these are important things to know for every competition. And this is one of sort of the more important things of what I'm going to say tonight. And that is, first of all, you must clearly demonstrate using concrete examples how you meet the essential education and experience criteria and any asset experience and education criteria. So like I've said, if you don't meet all the asset criteria, don't worry about that. But you need to meet all the essential criteria, but you have to demonstrate that using concrete examples, right? So some of the weaker applications I've seen, for example, let's just say the essential criteria is, do you have knowledge of SAR remote sensing? Quite often we get applications where people saying, yes, I have knowledge of SAR remote sensing. And then they leave it at that. Answering yes and not backing up your answer means that your application will not proceed on to the next stage because you haven't provided sufficient demonstration that you meet that criteria. Similarly, I've seen applications where people have said, yes, I have experience in SAR remote sensing. See resume for details. Again, you will not make it on to the next step of the competition. Two reasons for that. One is that hiring managers aren't going to do the work for you. We're not going to go to your resume and decide whether or not you've qualified or not. You know, that is up to you to articulate to us, right? So it has to be articulated. It's okay pointing people to your resume. I have 15 publications in SAR remote sensing. See resume for details, right? That's fine. As long as you've given clear examples. And usually what we say here, things, and you see this in these bullet points here. So you have to clearly demonstrate how you meet the criteria. Yes, I meet them isn't enough. What we say here is that resume is used as a secondary source to validate what you see in the letter. You have to explain how you meet each criteria. Now, let's just say, for example, you said, I have experience doing remote sensing. Again, not a good enough answer. What we want to hear or what we want to see is a description of your roles and responsibilities and your accomplishments, as well as the time periods over which you acquired the experience. So for example, last competition we were involved with, you know, we had people saying, you know, I worked on a multidisciplinary project on the mapping of wetlands, and I have experience in SAR. That's great, but that was a project involving 35 people. I have no idea what you did and how you gained that experience in that context. So what we're saying to people is, you can say, I worked on a multidisciplinary project mapping wetlands with SAR. In this project, I was responsible for boom, 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 talking about what you're responsible for during the period, you know, 2012 to 2014, et cetera, giving those concrete details in terms of what you did, what your role was in the context of that larger project. So you have to give the details. You're giving as many details as possible. And we'll talk about it, you know, when you actually fill these in to your job application, there's a word limit, right? But they give you usually sort of 200 words to demonstrate each one of these criteria, which is usually sufficient to give a number of examples to say, yes, absolutely. You know, I did that, and here are the examples. Of course, the flip side is a failure to clearly demonstrate how you meet these criteria results in the rejection of your application. It's not may result in the rejection, it will result in the rejection of your application. Because we need the applicants to clearly demonstrate yourself how it is you meet those criteria. And if you miss something, we don't phone you up and say, hey, you're missing something. You know, that doesn't happen. You know, incomplete or missing information is left, and it will negatively affect your application. So those important messages were from Agriculture Canada posting, and they were there for good reason, because these are the most common mistakes that people actually make. But in the DFO posting that I'm showing you, those messages aren't there. Each department will have different sort of canned important messages depending on the position. And then what you'll see is the intent of the process. So for this DFO process, they're going to hire a couple of people, and then a list of qualified candidates in a pool, these kinds of things. Information you must provide is a resume, but you will also fill out the information in terms of your cover letter. And again, I forgot I put the animations in to cover each one of these in detail. So if we take a look, for example, at the application here, I'm going to actually see, hopefully you can see the entire slide and not my banner that runs across the top here, because we have sort of in my presentation, at least, I can't see the headings on my slides. So in order to be considered for the application, at least in this example, you have to explain how you meet the following essential qualifications. And then underneath, what we have here is DFO have called it other qualifications, but they're the asset qualifications. So what you can actually do is you can number these in turn. And that's exactly what I used to do. I would number these in turn, and I go through, and you have to address every single one of these individually to show how you meet them. The really good news is when you're applying for these things online now, it's a lot more difficult to make mistakes. Back in the day where you had to write letters, you'd have to, you know, write all this stuff out, you'd print up your cover letter and you'd send it in. And if you missed one of these experiences or one of the essential qualifications, you got screened out. There was no sort of error check there. The good news is when we apply online, usually what happens is you're going to be prompted. So in this case here, as you're completing your application online, a dialog box will come up and say, do you have experience in acquiring, processing, analyzing remote sensing and geomatics data? This first experience question. And you click yes. And then the next dialog box will come up, say, explain in 200 words or less how you meet this criteria. And this is where you get into all the detail. You get to talk about the really cool stuff. Now, if you have more than 200 words, because it's usually 200 words or less, or you want to show some publications you've done or whatever it is, and you're like, I'm going to run out of words. This is where you put your publications in your resume and you say, see resume for my publications, right? So you can refer back to the resume as supporting documentation. So in this case here, there's actually 4 essential qualifications. The first is a graduation with a degree from a recognized university within these disciplines listed here. The second is, third and the fourth are these experiences. You have experiences in acquiring, using remote sensing and these kinds of things. And then you actually have, these are the likes, these are the assets. You know, we need you to have an undergraduate degree essential, but we'd like you to have a master's degree. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other sort of qualifications that aren't essential. They're asset qualifications, things we would really, really like you to have. And what you're going to notice here is, as we talk about these applications, is usually when we start to look at the assets, sort of and the essential qualifications, that there's sort of 2 really important ones. One is called what we call the experience questions, and the second is what we call the knowledge questions. And the knowledge questions are, you obviously have to demonstrate you know things, and those are tested in a test. The experience is work you've done, graduate school, undergraduate, these kinds of things in that sphere. So this is all experience here. So if I move on to the next slide, what we see here is these are other knowledge abilities as well. So it says here, the following will be assessed at a later date, essential for the job. So here we actually have knowledge of certain things, right? Knowledge of the physical principles of remote sensing, knowledge of GIS. And then we have things related to abilities. And the wording is very, very clear here. So we have experience, we have knowledge, but we also have abilities. And each one of these is sort of testable in varying ways. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And here we see the operational requirements. You know, are you going to be able to work overtime, evenings and weekends? Are you going to be able to travel? And depending on the job, it might be a lot of travel or it might be little travel. And we'll talk a little bit about these in more detail. Yeah, so one last thing about competitions, where things get really messy is usually when you go onto the job site, what you actually see, it's an advertisement for a single position or a couple of people. Geomatics analyst, we're hiring 2 people. But there's also something called pooled staffing. And within the government of Canada, what people realize quite quickly is it's economies of scale. You know, if I'm running a job competition, it makes more sense for people within my branch to say, yeah, we'd like to hire people in this realm too. Let's all get together and run one big competition with a bunch of different streams. And then we have 10 people working on this job competition rather than do 10 different competitions. And it makes sense. So pooled staffing is what we've started to see, where departments hire for different positions under the same classification. Sometimes different classifications, but under the same classification. So a good example would be, you know, for an EC5 position, for a policy analyst, data analyst, climate analyst, geomatics analyst, image analyst. And where this gets quite complicated is what you end up seeing is that there will be essential requirements and asset requirements that are common to all of these. So they'll say common essential requirements, common asset requirements. And then each one of these streams will have essential and asset requirements. So it gets quite complicated because, okay, I have to deal with the common stuff and then the ones specific to the streams in which I'm going to apply for. And then the second thing is that pooled staffing actions, because generally speaking, they're larger competitions, you get a lot of applications. One that I was with another department 10 years ago, I spent 2 years in another department doing science, we had over 1,000 applications. Now, 700 of those applications were because there was a policy analyst stream. So generally speaking, if there's a policy analyst stream, you get a lot of applications. But it took us more than a year because we had to go through 1,000 applications. And then we tested, I don't know, 500 or 600 people. Then we had to interview a couple hundred people and, getting it down. So pooled staffing competitions can take a long time because you get a volume of applications. But the process is the same. You just get to pick and choose what you want to apply for. All right, so let's get into the nitty gritty of this. And it's funny because I told John I'd only talk for 40 minutes, but we'll go for another 15 or so. So when you're applying your cover letter, and like I say, when you apply for a job, there's two things that you're going to do. You're going to include that resume as the secondary resource. We've already talked about that. But with your application, you're including a cover letter. We still call it a cover letter, but like I said, it's not really a cover letter. And interactively on the system, what will happen when you're applying is they'll take a look at those essential qualifications and say, do you have knowledge of this? And if the answer is yes, then you go ahead and you get a text box with 200 words in which to demonstrate the answer. If you hit no, I don't know that, I don't have that essential qualification, then you're not going to be considered further. But it's nice because it's a check. You're not going to miss anything. Yes, I have that. Yes, I have that experience. Cut and paste my answer. I put it in there, move on to the next question. That's sort of your electronic cover letter. But like I said, you have to meet all the essential qualifications. This is required. If you don't meet an essential qualification, you will be disqualified from the competition, right? That is what will happen. The second thing with asset qualifications, these are the desirables, like I've said, is you don't get disqualified from the competition, but they are used to identify more specific needs. And when I worked for another department for 2 years, it was my own competition was a pooled staffing competition. There was about 1,200 applicants. One of the streams was statistical analyst, and they were looking for a remote sensing person. 12 of us ended up as statistical analysts in the pool, one of which had remote sensing GIS experience in their resume. So they went back to the resume and they said, oh, this person has what we need. And that's what distinguishes him from the other candidates is the GIS and the remote sensing and the geospatial stuff. So the asset stuff you try and hit, and it's good to put in there because it's a tiebreaker. It's the gravy on top that may get you the position. And people say, well, that doesn't really count. I said, well, I'm a good example of that. My first permanent job with the government of Canada, I was hired because of my asset qualifications, in addition to meeting the essential criteria. And then the other stuff listed. And sometimes they'll ask you about it, and other times they won't. And on the online system, if they don't ask you about sort of the additional stuff, can you work overtime, these kinds of things, then you're not necessarily going to answer that question. But it's always a good idea to demonstrate that you meet the requirements. Sentence, yeah, I can work overtime and have a driver's license and these kinds of things. So this is when you're applying. Make sure you get this down, okay? In terms of doing this, what I would say is when you're demonstrating that you meet the requirements, parrot back the language as specified in the statement of merit criteria. And it's in this bullet point, bullet number 1 here. And I'll give you a good example why, if you don't do that, you can run into trouble. I've seen before, for example, instances where, they'll say, do you have experience in optical remote sensing? And somebody might say, I have experience in Earth observation. And they'll go ahead and answer the question. Depending on who the manager is, the hiring manager, and who's doing the screening, sometimes is that gray area where things become misinterpreted. You and I and everybody in this meeting today knows that Earth observation is the same thing as remote sensing, but not everybody does. So what I've said is you parrot back exactly the language. And if we go back to that previous slide, let's just say, for example, you are filling out the example, knowledge of physical principles of remote sensing. And they'll ask you the question, do you have this knowledge? You would say, I have knowledge of the physical principles of remote sensing for Earth observation in optical and radar remote sensing. That's my first sentence of my answer. That chews up about 20 words. For example, and then you go on and you demonstrate it. Parrot back that language. Don't give people an excuse just because of terminology to misinterpret what you said. Parrot back the language. Your response to each one of these should start with this: yes, I have experience in, I have knowledge of, I have the ability to communicate effectively orally. For example, I give tons of presentations, right? So this is what you actually want to do. And I think that, because that gets rid of any, I would say, miscommunication, any vagueness there, okay? So you've applied and you've done all these things and you're qualified. So what then happens is they're going to contact you and they say, we want you to come in and write a test. Now, mostly 99% of the time, well, all the time, what are the tests going to be based on? The tests are based on the original, what we call the job poster's merit criteria, right? They're not going to ask you anything on the test that hasn't been demonstrated in what they want in terms of the statement merit criteria. It will, most of the time, include questions on knowledge and ability of skills. Now, notice that second bullet there doesn't say anything about experience. Now, some departments, I know of one department, for example, that might test you on experience. When you go and write a test, they'll say, tell me about your experience with such and such. Usually that comes later in the process. What we do at this step with the written test, because my human resources advisors have said, well, we can't test for experience, but we can test for knowledge and we can test for your ability to do things. So usually in a test, you'll be tested on knowledge. So it's kind of like a university exam. You'll be asked to explain things and go through these kinds of things. And then there may be other questions relating to ability. So you get these sort of hypothetical, theoretical questions in terms of time management, or what would you do if, or they may ask you to write a briefing note. Right? That is testing your ability to synthesize material. They may ask you to sort of draft a presentation, these kinds of things. But it's usually knowledge and the abilities and skills. This is what you're going to get tested on. Tests will be maybe. Now, the tests, like I've said, they can include questions related to the essential and asset qualifications. And like I've said, the tests, the questions relating to the experience are usually reserved for the interview. Now, these tests can be multiple choice or short answer, occasionally long answer, but they're more difficult to grade. They are administered under controlled conditions usually, although sometimes they're take home, and it depends. The sheer task of coordinating 1,000 people to take a test from a pool staffing across the country is a complete disaster. So quite often what organizations will do is what we call these take home tests. So they'll mail you out the test and they'll say, we want it back in 3 hours. Or they'll give it to you and say, return it in 24 hours. So they'll do the testing format this way. Right? So these sort of virtual tests, and then you supply the answers. And then what will happen is with these take-home tests, though, what happens next is slightly different, because you're sitting there saying, well, people could cheat on these tests. And the answer is, yes, they could. So if you do a take-home test, there will be probably some kind of knowledge question on the interview coming up after, in order to make sure that you really know what you're talking about. So usually they're administered under controlled conditions, just like at a university, but sometimes there'll be take-home tests. A couple of hours, if you're there writing it in person, 24 hours sometimes if it's a take-home test. Now, one note thing, and this is from personal experience about writing these types of tests and prioritizing time. I once, for example, did a job competition with an organization where they asked us to answer 20 questions in 2 hours. 10 questions on what we would call the essential criteria and 10 on the asset criteria. And I was writing this with a bunch of colleagues and we left that test and they said, boy, we answered our 20 questions, but we don't think we did very well, because 20 questions in 2 hours is a lot, and none of them were screened further. And I said to them, I didn't answer 20 questions. I answered 10 questions and I got screened through to the next stage. Why was that? Because I focused on the essential questions, knowing fine well that they couldn't fail me on a test for not answering the asset questions, because that's the way it works, right? So prioritizing, knowing these subtle kinds of things may make a slight difference. Usually, and that, to be honest with you, was the only test I've actually ever done that operated that way. Usually there's more than enough time in these tests for you to do the test and not feel stressed and walk out, with stuff undone. And then what happens is you get the results of the test, pass or fail. It's usually communicated by email and through your jobs profile. So then what happens is, let's say you pass that, you get onto the interview stage. You're going to come in, you're going to do an interview. Now, again, most of the time what will happen, it certainly happens in agriculture, is there will be the the recognition is we've already asked you questions on ability and knowledge in the test. So we're not going to ask you about that anymore. What we're going to do now is in the interview, we're going to ask you about some other stuff. And we may focus on experience, for example. So again, interviews are based on the statement of merit criteria, and they will address what we call the competencies, those requirements not addressed in the test, usually experience or the ability or personal suitability. Now, if you've done a take-home test, quite often they will ask you knowledge questions in the interview because they want to make sure you haven't copied and pasted off the internet. One of the jobs I applied for that I was interviewed for, they started asking me knowledge questions on statistics in the interview. And they said, we're asking you these questions because it was a take-home test. And, you know, for all we know, you went to Wikipedia. So it's sort of that secondary check. But if that's not the case, then in these interviews, what they're going to do is they're going to ask you about experience and other types of things not addressed earlier. Now, usually there's a committee of a number of people. We won't get into the HR regulations of this. Usually there's somebody from human resources around the table, sometimes not always, and then 2 or 3 other people. And what we do is we ask questions. Let's say, for example, the test is scheduled for an hour. You would come in. An hour beforehand. 30 minutes before the interview, usually we put you in a room by yourself and we give you the list of questions. So we say, here's 30 minutes. You have 30 minutes to prepare. This is what we're going to ask you in the interview. You come into the interview and you answer the questions. And depending on the style of interview, sometimes what happens is the people in the room will sort of herd you through the questions. Okay, question 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. In other types and more senior positions, they'll say you manage your own time. So these interviews usually done in front of a committee. And they usually, you know, I talk about the sort of the tell us about a time when questions because they're scenarios. So they'll tell us about a time where you worked with a difficult employee. And then there's a whole bunch of sub questions. Tell us about the situation, who you were working for, what the problem is, what you did to resolve conflict, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to hit each of these bullets. And hopefully you've prepared something. Now, the beautiful part about this is once you've gone through one set of interviews, say with the Government of Canada, what you find is there's recurring themes, you know, working with other teams, coordination, difficult employees, difficult, you know, colleagues, these kinds of things. And in your mind, once you've done these interviews, you're always going to leave an interview and you're going to say, oh no, I should have used another example. I had a better example than that. You know what? Maybe you did. You can use that example next time. But you see sometimes these repeatable themes, and it means the more you do this, the more solid your answers become. You say, I know what I'm going to use for this kind of question. And it doesn't necessarily have to be related to geomatics. The best answer I've ever had as a hiring manager, we were hiring technicians a number of years ago. We had somebody come in and we asked them, again, it had something to do with work or difficult employees. And they said, I'm going to use an example from when I was 18 and I worked in a bike shop. And they gave us this fantastic example demonstrating that they met all the criteria. One of the other hiring managers said, well, they failed. This, you know, had nothing to do with geomatics. And we said, nowhere does it say that your examples have to be within the field of geomatics. It doesn't say that anywhere. So, you know, the example was taken. I use that example to today to demonstrate that you can get examples from anywhere as long as they sort of meet those requirements. So usually the interviews are about an hour, rarely longer than that, but tack on half an hour to begin with to do your preparation. And of course, you know, you go through that process, and if you pass, they're going to let you know. And if they let you know you've passed your interview, then great. They're going to ask you for letters of recommendation, or at least a phone number for which you're going to contact somebody. That person will be asked a series of short questions. And then what will happen is, if it's a bilingual position, you have to demonstrate you might meet those bilingual requirements. So how do you demonstrate that? Well, what they'll do is they'll send you for a test. So you go do the comprehension tests, writing test, and if you do well enough in those, you do the oral proficiency tests right at the end of it. And then what happens if you satisfy all those criteria, you end up in a pool of qualified candidates. And these are all candidates that technically, because of the application test and interview, are qualified for the position. Now, what you have to realize is, well, how do we choose the best candidate? Now, the way it used to work is each candidate would be ranked by score, and you had to choose the best candidate. And that worked, and it didn't work, because there was this sort of assumption that your number one on the list was the person best qualified for the position. And as we all know through our university education, is that person might just be the person who's been around and is really good at writing tests. So, they were finding this didn't really work so well. So we have the hiring managers have the flexibility to what we call personal suitability, where you can go back to somebody's resume and say, you know what, this person didn't really score as high in some of these aspects as somebody else. But you know what, I really like the 5 years that they did SAR data processing for MDA. We want that, right? So you have a little bit of discretion there. So anyway, you end up in this pool of candidates, and we hire the preferred candidate. The beautiful part too is if you don't get the job, you remain in a pool, and these pools are usually active for 2 years. And what will happen is you remain in that pool, which you can be picked for from this department or other departments with similar requirements. So a good example is we got a pulse of money through the Canadian Space Agency, through RadarSat constellation mission type of work. And I had to hire somebody. I wanted to hire somebody capable very quickly, but I knew a job competition was going to take maybe 8 to 12 months. So I went to Natural Resources Canada, knowing that they had a pool of qualified candidates from a competition they'd run a while before. And literally 10 days before that pool timed out, I picked somebody off the list, a former student of mine off the list who was highly qualified. And it was fantastic because all I had to say to my department was our requirements, they would have to meet the same requirements. If we ran a competition, then they've already met. So if you're in the pool, you might get called immediately. But in this case, the person we hired was called something like almost 23 months after being in that pool to come and work with us. So, you're in a pool. Sometimes they extend the pools. You're made eligible for selection by another job competition that has similar needs. Now, you can't just say, and here's the nice thing too, is if you're in a pool, people start shopping around. They'll talk to hiring managers, say, I'm in a PC2 pool. That's not good enough. Hey, you're hiring a PC2? I'm in a PC2 pool. What pool are you in? I'm in a geomatics and Earth observation pool. Oh, that's too bad. I'm hiring a soil scientist, right? So it's a PC, not all PC2s are the same, right? We have different subject matter requirements. So just to finish off, this is, I think, my last couple of slides. Inventories. Do not confuse inventories with pools. I have people say, you could bring me in and hire me. And I'm like, oh, really? They say, well, I'm on an inventory. Now, an inventory is sort of where you get to post your resume and these kinds of things on the online system for a given department for possible use in future hiring, but you've never been tested, right? So with inventories, what you do is you post your resume, you demonstrate that you meet certain qualifications of positions, but what you don't do is you've never been invited for a test and you've never been invited to an interview. So sometimes people get confused and say, I'm in an inventory, you can hire me. I'm like, yeah, it doesn't work that way. You're not applying for a specific job. You're just basically putting placeholder, here's my stuff. And then as positions become available, what it means is you may be directly contacted for further assessment. The nice thing here is this is sort of the advertisement of a positions. And you see in this example here, look at all these different classifications. AS is up to reses. I mean, the pay scale in there goes from $50,000 to $160,000. This is basically all the different qualifications that you could possibly imagine at the Canada Centre for, I was going to say Canada Centre for Remote Sensing, but CCMEO. So you would post there and you go through the sort of the original process that we've talked about today. And then what will happen is a hiring manager can go to that inventory and say, you know what, I'm looking for a PC2 who meets these requirements. And then they're sort of skipping over that first step and saying, okay, we would like to assess you further. And then you can go through the assessment process. So there is a difference between inventories and pools. And the last thing is student bridging. If you're a co-op student, if you work through FESWEP, if you work for the Research Affiliate Program, guess what? You can be bridged without competition into a Government of Canada position. Now, there's some caveats with that. And the two caveats there is what I would say is, first of all, you can only be bridged into junior positions. You're not going to be bridged into a senior position, even if you have a graduate degree, even if you have a PhD. You can only be bridged into junior positions. So that's the first thing. But you're being bridged without competition. What that means is you don't have to compete for a job. There is an HR process. Often we like to use these for short pulses of money. Let's say I have need of a term employee to work with the Agroclimate Information Service for a year doing drought monitoring and forecasting. I need somebody pretty quickly. I don't have 12 months to hire somebody. We could bridge one of our former students, for example, and we would give them a term position. So a position with a definite end date on that. So this is why I say to students, if you have the opportunity of doing co-op with your program, and Carleton, for example, Carleton University, the geography program down there now has a co-op program. And when I'm teaching down there, I have students saying, yeah, the co-op's not going to do anything for me. I'm like, yeah, you sure about that? Because from a Government of Canada perspective, there's these bridging, and we've bridged a number of students into term positions over the years. And I'll tell you, you know, coming out with an undergraduate, a strong undergraduate degree, being bridged in, say, a PC1 position, being embedded in a science team, learning all this stuff, even though it's a position of a fixed length, when you come out and you graduate, your resume is looking a lot better. It's looking very, very strong. And quite often what happens after these term positions are winding down, depending on need and availability, we can flip these positions into permanent positions. It doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes it just can't happen all the time. But in some cases, it's possible to do that further down the line. So it gives you more opportunity from a federal perspective. And it's not just co-op, it's FESWEP and RAP also when opportunities arise. So there are some limitations around this, but what it actually shows is if you've ever been part of some of these programs, then you're eligible sort of for that bridging process. And it's a lot easier to do than running a big competition. But there's a window, right? I believe it's a 2-year window since your last sort of interaction with the government. So let's say you graduate, there is a window after which you graduate that you could be bridged into a position. You can't come back 6 years later and say, can you bridge me? Because you've been out of school for 6 years. Okay, so that's bridging. And I will leave it there. I went significantly over my, I would say, allotted time, but I said in our presentation, and now, you know, we can, that's okay. I'm going to pass back to John to moderate the questions, which I will try and answer to the best of my ability.